Our next speaker is Kelly Hyde. He is going to present virtual, right? Well, I'm just going to say that you are at Rand in Pittsburgh, an associate economist with an interest in environmental and behavioral determinants of health outcomes. And you have the floor.
Thanks so much for having me. As mentioned, I'm an economist at Rand. This is co-authored work with Wendy Bruin de Bruin, Catherine Carmen, and Andy Parker. Just note, because I know these norms kind of differ across disciplines, sometimes these authors are presented in alphabetical order in keeping with the norms in economics. So today I'll be talking about perceived analogies of mpox, formerly known as monkeypox. I'll explain a little bit about that in a bit, and associated worry. So in 2022, the global outbreak of mpox, which is the new name for monkeypox designated by the World Health Organization, intended to avoid some stigma or racial undertones that were concerns about the name monkeypox, introduced many people to the disease for the first time. So I pulled a quote here. It's the first time, according to the World Health Organization, that many mpox cases and clusters have been reported concurrently in non-endemic and endemic countries in widely disparate geographical areas. So included in this was the United States. There was kind of a low level of familiarity with this disease in the US. And we know from prior work, so I'm newer to this work, but my three co-authors are not. They have done work on this in terms of COVID, and their work has shown that mental associations or analogies influence risk perceptions and protective behaviors. So there are several possible anchors for mpox analogies, and that makes this context really interesting. So when you think about COVID, it's a respiratory disease, and so the analogies there are maybe a little bit clearer. You're thinking about flu, SARS, pneumonia, et cetera, kind of diseases that have similar paths of transmission and similar symptoms. But in this case, there are a lot of different directions you could potentially go. So you could look at the name pox and think, oh, it's like chicken pox or like smallpox. You could associate it with visible skin conditions because one of the most discussed parts of it are the kind of visible skin lesions that are produced by the disease. You could think about it in terms of sexually transmitted infections, because even though mpox is not technically considered an STI, one of the dominant modes of transmission between individuals, particularly among men who have sex with men, is through sexual contact. Or you might think about emergent or other pandemic diseases. Obviously, we're still in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, so that might be at the top of your mind as well. So our first research question that we try to address with this is, what are the most common mpox analogies? What do people think of when we just ask them what comes to mind? And I'll talk a little bit more about that methodology on the next slide. Our second research question is, we want to go deeper and say, among the analogies that we observe, how do those correlate with risk perceptions and protective behavior intentions? And so we want to know, does it seem like people who tend to associate mpox with one type of disease seem to systematically differ in their risk perceptions or willingness to engage in protective behaviors such as vaccination versus others? And then the third research question is, how do mpox analogies differ across demographic groups? And I'll get back to that closer to the end. So our approach, we embedded just 3 questions in a broader survey on the UAS. And since this is a panel about, uses of the UAS, I would mention here that this is really a demonstration of how powerful doing something on the panel can be, because all we're going to ask is just 3 short questions, and then we're going to be able to leverage the really rich contextual data on these panelists by merging in items from other surveys run on the same panel to contextualize all of this. So these were the only 3 questions that we asked. First, when you think of mpox, what other diseases come to mind? And we asked them to list up to 3 other diseases. Then we asked, how worried are you that you might get sick from mpox? And this was a Likert scale question where 1 was a value of very worried and 4 was a value of not at all worried. So increasing numbers on our risk perception scale suggest a lower perception of risk. And then finally, we asked if a healthcare provider recommended that you get an mpox vaccine, and assuming that one was available and free to you, what is the % chance that you would get vaccinated? So in this case, we're trying to get to intentions to engage in certain protective behaviors, namely take up of a vaccine for mpox. The data that we ended up with, we have 7,815 total respondents on the panel. And remember, I said they could list up to 3 diseases. So that results in 17,914 interpretable disease associations. And when I say interpretable disease associations, I'm referring to a coding process by which we took the raw inputs and we coded them into a number of diseases based on how closely the text matched the text of that disease. So obviously there's differences in terms of spelling, in terms of hyphenation in cases of COVID-19. We wanted to bin all of those into proper codes, and we were able to do that for a very large subsample of our responses. So we ended up with almost 18,000 interpretable associations. Of those 7,815 who answered the survey, 96% of them listed at least 1 disease. And so our non-response rate at all is about 4%. And then 55% of them, or a majority, did list 3 diseases. So people could list up to 3 diseases. They didn't necessarily have to list all 3. Strikingly, among the people who did list at least 1 disease, 96% of them mentioned at least one of the following: chickenpox, COVID, smallpox, HIV, AIDS, and measles. So if you remember back to what I said of the potential directions of analogies, really seems like those do pop out, and everybody, almost everybody, is thinking about one of these diseases when we mention mpox. In terms of summary statistics for the other questions, we find moderate average willingness to vaccinate, about 41% unconditional average probability, and a low average risk perception, where the average on that Likert scale is about 3.2 out of 4. So this puts the frequencies of all the codes, the names along the side of the axis here are all of the codes that we generated, with the exception of some meaningless codes that we've been things that we couldn't really interpret any other way. And I've highlighted those 5 diseases that I mentioned before because they were the dominant ones, but there are still some other diseases that show up, and that speaks to the richness of this data as well. One of the advantages of this method is that you don't pre-specify a list of diseases to choose from or something like that. You just ask people to list whatever they're thinking of. And so you can get answers that you didn't necessarily anticipate. Something like shingles or mumps or syphilis, leprosy, all of these, some people do seem to be thinking about them, but they're not the most common. Now, in terms of correlations across these key diseases, the main takeaway from this is that seems like chickenpox and measles tend to go together, and HIV, AIDS, and other, and I'm not going to show this explicitly, but that other is predominantly STIs, are seemingly correlated together. This slide shows that also, so this gets to that research question of, is there differences in risk perceptions and protective behaviors based on the analogies that you have. So here I've plotted the 5 figures, and you see that people who mentioned smallpox, much more willing to vaccinate, and people who mentioned COVID the same, whereas people who mentioned HIV, AIDS are significantly less willing to vaccinate. I think, oh, there we go. Okay, so now I'm going to quickly go through these regression slides. Basically, we find significant differences by race, and I'm going to speed this up a little bit for time, by other demographics, so gender, age, college degree, all of these are pulled in from other surveys on the UAS, income, Sexual orientation, which is a really interesting one. Contrary to what our priors were, it seemed that actually heterosexual individuals were more likely to say HIV/AIDS than homosexual or bisexual individuals. And then political party affiliation, which also seems to be a significant source of heterogeneity here. And so kind of putting this all in context really quickly, we find that first, there are significant differences in risk perceptions and willingness to vaccinate based on what your analogies are. And also, there are significant differences in what analogies come up most frequently based on demographics. And so the next step for us is that we want to put this together and see, can we do a kind of mediation analysis to figure out to what extent does difference in analogies explain the differences in risk perceptions and protective behaviors that we observe? We also would like to identify some clusters of disease associations, and also, if we can, so everything that I've said up to this point has been correlation, but we are interested in pursuing, seeing, can we tease out a kind of causal story here? Is there a causal direction of these associations? So that's all, and thank you again so much, and happy to answer any questions at the end.